Well, guys, welcome back to our continued coverage of Baltimore Comic-Con. What an amazing Kirby Fourth World panel that was. Big thank you to Mr. Robert Meyer Burnett. Huge thank you to Cecil Castellucci, Mr. Tom King. We're going to keep the ball rolling and talk about the Marvel Age with two people that, I mean, honestly, need zero introduction. Two people that I'm finding myself to be closer friends with over the years. Mr. Mark Waid, how you doing, sir?
Good.
Looking good, sounding good, and the winner of game show from yesterday, Mr. Tom Brevoort.
Hello.
How are you doing, sir? I'm going to go ahead and get out of you guys' way, but I want to congratulate you, Tom.
All right, hold on for just 1 second. I've got to log out and log back in. It's a StreamYard thing, but I'll be right back, I promise.
Go for it. I'm going to talk to Tom and just really quickly congratulate you on your amazing win yesterday.
Thank you so much.
For those of you guys who missed it, we had a game show about midday yesterday, and Tom came in and literally cleaned house. Didn't get a single question wrong. He actually he wiped the floor with the competition. It was a very impressive
and then
performance.
Later in the evening, somebody asked a question online, and I completely muffed it. So easy come, easy go. But when the camera was on in that moment, I was on point. After
you were the king.
Total disaster.
It was great. I'm going to get out of you guys' way, man. You guys have a fun time. I think a lot of people are interested in what you guys are going to talk about. So, in a bit.
All right.
I'm interested in finding out what we're going to talk about. So.
We'll find a way. So what were some of the tougher questions?
Honestly, because the round I actually played was, like 3 minute, like bonus round, just question. And I would answer them and I would immediately forget what the question was.
Yeah.
I was on to the next one. I think the one that took me the longest to come up with an answer was what villain or who was responsible for the destruction of Beta Ray Bill's homeworld.
Oh, you've stumped the band here. But my knowledge stops about the time I got into college. So
yeah. I took a flyer based on knowing that was Walt's story.
Yeah.
And I said it was Surtur, and it was. So
there you go.
So it worked out in my favor. But everything else, I remember, who penciled the cover of Amazing Fantasy 15. I remember. God, this was yesterday, and it's all just out of my head. I retain nothing. I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere.
I got one for you that came to me the other day.
Okay.
Who coined you've probably heard this one before. You're probably going to get this one. But who coined the phrase Avengers Assemble?
I think it was Iron Man. It was either Iron Man or Thor. It was in Avengers. I think it was 14, maybe 13. It's just a throwaway thing. And it's interesting, in how Stan would develop this stuff, because it was just a line of dialogue. Like, he came up with it and clearly he liked it. And 2 issues later, they do the roster change. Yep. And it's a balloon the size of Manhattan over Captain America's head. And they all talk about it in that issue like, never again will we say the words Avengers Assemble.
You've never said them before.
You've only said them once. Like, this is a big deal. But, it was. So who was it, actually Iron Man or Thor?
I want to say, actually, it was at the end of Avengers 15, and it was Hank.
There's an earlier one. It's in the middle of the middle of a fight. I don't remember off the top of my head if it was 14 when they're all fighting the alien guys, or if it was 13 where they're somewhere in the middle of the Count Nefaria fight. But it's literally a 6-panel page. It's just one balloon of somebody. I think it's Iron Man, but it could be Thor. I got a very strong Don Heck image in my head, and it's just him kind of like freeing himself from whatever thing he's in the middle of, and kind of going, okay, let's go, guys, Avengers Assemble, and away they go. And it was a throwaway, and Stan just liked the cadence of it, and so he kept using it.
Good. I like the fact that it came in with some drama, because the one I read, it was not only Hank, but it was off panel. It was just a balloon coming in from off panel. So
yep. Well, like, so much of this stuff was just was not at all planned.
No.
It's clobbering time is like that. That was just a line one month, and Stan liked it, and so he used it the next month too. And then by the 3rd time, it got a balloon by itself, and by the 6th time, it was all display lettering.
Everybody forgets that everybody working in comics back then thought this stuff would last for another 3 or 4 years tops, and it would all be gone.
At best.
Yeah.
Also, and this is the thing that's always like, as I've gone back and I've worked some of this stuff out, that always amazes me is so often, particularly on the books that I read when I was first starting out reading, there was stuff that was being established for the first time that I was taking, oh, that's a thing that's been established for years. Clearly, that's an important bit of canonical information that somebody has set up somewhere, and I'm just learning it for the first time. And nope, he just made it up.
Yep.
Arkham Asylum, they needed to place that issue, so that's where he is.
That's it. It's amazing. Now. I mean, everybody now is working for the long game all the time. I mean, I tend to work by the seat of my pants, but even still, you think that this stuff is going to last a little while longer. So,
well, you certainly have the awareness that whatever you do in any given issue today is going to be seen by people and potentially read by people for years, and it's going to live on as trade paperbacks and digital and so forth. And so, you look back at particularly 70s comics where there were a lot of just throwaway fill-ins and random reprints and people just jamming to get 17 pages of anything done that month. And nobody works that way these days, because in those days the thought was, well, we're gonna make our press time. We're not gonna lose that money. Something's gonna go out. We're gonna generate a certain amount of revenue, and nobody's gonna care about it the month after. Nobody's gonna remember how many corners we had to cut, or the fact that this wasn't the particularly best comic ever done. And now every comic is there, a monument to mediocrity, and the conditions under which it was done forever.
Yeah.
Including all of those. So screw all those 70s guys. Hoist on their own petards. They're done.
You and I came in like right at the beginning of the point at which it's the glimmer of the idea that this stuff might be in print for a long time was taking hold. Like, because when I was writing Flash, the early Flashes, it never occurred to me that this stuff would ever be collected. That was 92, 93, and you came along, and when did you start? You started 89 or 90?
89. Very end of 89.
Yeah. And again, nobody had any thought.
No, not for the most part. Although even there was always interest. Like by the time I came in, this going back into the 70s and even the very, very late 60s, you started to get reprints of one sort or another, whether they were the famous first edition treasuries or all the earliest trade paperbacks. And by the time I came in, Marvel Masterworks had started, the DC Archives had started. They were both relatively brand new.
Yeah.
Like you could carry them all. They were few enough that you could have them in your hands. And the idea that there'd be comics that you were doing today would be in that format was insane.
No,
I find it insane that I have a Dazzler Masterworks. So
I know.
Yeah.
I don't want to name names. I don't want to cite things. But every month you open up the previous catalog and you see something that makes you go, I guess we just run out of stuff to reprint. I guess there's nothing left.
And it's true. And yet at the same time, I actually have a certain love or a certain joy for that. Like I think that those Dazzler books are the pinnacle of mediocrity.
Yeah.
They're not really all that good, and yet for somebody else, those are seminal comics. Those are comics they read when they were young, and they mean everything to them, or they couldn't read them. That they loved Dazzler, they found Dazzler somewhere along the years, and this is their chance in the same sort of way that I loved reading the 30s to the 70s books or the early origins of Marvel Comics books. So I appreciate the fact that absolute unremittent garbage has been collected between two covers. And I do kind of enjoy every once in a while. We put out something like It's the Complete Man Wolf.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like there's nobody on earth who wants the Complete Man Wolf, and yet I love the fact that it's there on a shelf somewhere in my library.
To the point where, and you and I share this DNA, I'll buy it, even though I have all that stuff in other places. All it would take is 10 minutes of me just gathering issues, but the fact that it's all under one cover, even as lame as some of that stuff is, it's still nice to have. Yeah.
It's the same thing with things like the DC anniversary collections. You know, they've been
Yeah.
doing the 80 years of this year, and a few years ago they did the 75 years of, and a few years before that the 70 years of. And it's not like the books are the same book.
But they're very
They
much the
line up
same. Yeah.
different stuff, but a
Yeah.
lot of that's. And every time I am a patsy, and every time
Yep.
I will go, yep, I want a collection of Robin stories. You bet. 80
Yep.
years of Robin. I like Robin.
I'm in.
80 years worth.
Yep.
I'm there. So
what was your involvement with the Marvel Masterworks coming in? I mean, they had begun by the time you got there, right?
Yes, as an intern, I worked as an intern in 3 editorial offices. There were 3 offices that were in a corner in the back of Marvel, and I ended up interning across all 3. One of which was the managing editor's office, and one of the things that they did was put the Masterworks together every year. So there's an early volume. It's Fantastic Four. I want to say 11 to 20. It's the one with Annual 1 in it.
Yeah.
Where I pasted the book up.
Cool.
You know, all the stats came in, and I got them shot, and I did the mechanicals because I knew how to do that, or knew enough how to do that, and they didn't want to wait for the bullpen to do it, so they gave them to me and said, "Hey, could you like put these all and do the, you know?" And so I did stuff like that. But I think that's only like masterwork.
They couldn't be like
4
or 5.
11 or 12.
Yeah.
So it was within. I think it was like the 3rd year they were doing them.
Yeah. But it's nice to have it in the hands of somebody who really cares about the material. I mean, that's the DC. I started the DC Archives program.
Yeah.
I think you knew, which Paul Levitz had this idea of we should do something with the first 4 issues of Superman. What do we do? And it was Richard Bruning and I who sat down and sort of figured out how to handle it. And then it was up to me to figure out where to find the material, which was virtually impossible because back then we had no digital. Back then it was Greg Theakston literally taking cut up pages from Action Comics and Superman and bleaching them in the sun.
Yeah.
So that we could retrace them and restat them. And that was man, it's just painful to watch an issue of Superman 2 just sliced up with ribbons. But I tried to get around it because I found Bill Blackbeard had a huge collection of the Superman newspaper strips, which all these stories were taken from.
Right,
so my big idea was, okay, great, we'll just use stats of those and we can reassemble the book, but it didn't quite work out that way. Wow. On the other hand, I got a really good, nice set of Superman daily strips out of it. There's that. But yeah, it was the other. But the other memory I have of that was asking Steranko to do an intro.
Yeah, he wrote that first intro.
And he made
I remember that.
Perfect sense because you and I both worship at the altar of the history of comics. And it was such a gigantic intro that I turned it into an intro and an afterward. But it was a really nice piece. That's the only hiccup that caused, not the intro, but the way we handled the book was, in retrospect, we should have done like the first dozen Action Comic stories or something.
Right.
Because now we are the Superman archives, but the first 3 issues of Superman are really mostly just reprints of Action Comic stuff.
Yeah.
So So by the time we get to the Action Comics archives, we'd already rerun that stuff.
Right. Yeah, in the end, you made a bunch of choices and it worked out all right. But nobody knew you were going to be doing Action Comics archives down the line, or that would be the thing. Superman archives and Batman archives, and the Batman archives was detective. So once it came time to reprint Batman, it had to be called something different.
Else. Right.
It had the all Flash problem.
Yes. Well, the other trick was, and the Marvel Masterworks has really hung on to it nicely, is trying to come up with a design, like an actual graphic design for the jacket and the book and the look and the book itself that would last, that would not look dated after a while.
Right.
And I don't know whether it's because I'm just so used to the Marvel Masterworks trade dress, but it still looks fresh to me.
It's a nice design, and it's held up largely just by the willpower of the people that want all their books to look the same.
Yeah.
Because even there was that period where the Masterworks went away, and then they came back, and then they were designed differently, and then they came back again, and they were designed differently again. And people like yourself, you made dust jackets for your volumes.
Yep. So they would match. Yep. Yes,
And
I
you
did.
were not the only one. And so eventually, like, all those books were reprinted with the earlier dust jacket, and eventually now they release those new volumes in 2 formats. So
Yeah.
depending on which cover setups that you have, you can have a matching set. My set is all over the place.
Yeah.
My set is whatever version I ended up getting, either at the office or whenever I bought a copy. So and I stared at it, and there were times when I thought, oh, I'll just get dust jackets for the other, and eventually I realized that was just going to drive me crazy, and
Yeah.
I need to let go. It's like that one Legion volume of the Legion archives where the spine is
It's
different.
completely out of whack. Yes, which I had to remake from scratch. Yes.
No, in my world, it is just a protruding true tooth on my bookcase.
But see, when the day is done and everything comes home to roost and it's all over, you'll have lived 30 more minutes than I did. So, or at least done something arguably more interesting, more worthwhile over the 30 minutes. So, but it's so we both have that itch. We both have that. I think you said it once really well, which is that there's no place you can't stand in that room you're in right now and like touch 5 different copies of Fantastic Four #1 somewhere.
Yes,
So.
yes. And yet, if they put out the right version of it, they're working on Charlie Kochman right now at Abrams. They're redoing the Walter Mosley Maximum Fantastic Four, the book where he wrote essays,
right. Yeah.
and they blew it all up. And the mistake that was made originally was they didn't shoot it from an actual copy of Fantastic Four. They used Masterworks film or whatnot. So they're redoing the whole thing top to bottom. And in this case, they're rescanning and redesigning it. They've got, I forget who's designing it. And so that's like another $40 out of my out of my life, that I don't need to spend, but I absolutely will spend when the book drops.
Well, talking about Fantastic Four #1, so you have on your blog, tombrevoort.com, like this great assemblage of various theories that we've all had over the years, and you seem to be the biggest proponent of this idea that, and I think I'm with you, that Fantastic Four #1 was not really intended to be as it was printed. Like, can you go into some detail about that?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. It's a little difficult because we don't actually have a copy here in front of us, and I can't share any visuals. But Fantastic Four #1, if you stare at it, particularly with an editorial eye, with an eye that's used to detecting lettering corrections or art extensions or things, in the same way you can look at like Action Comics #1 and see all the places where, Schuster had to extend panels, or they had to rework stuff to turn newspaper strips into comic book pages. There's a lot of that stuff in evidence in Fantastic Four #1. And so, just trying to look at the evidence that is there, and work backwards to go, okay, what does that imply or what does that mean? It seems, at least in my assessment, that first issue of FF is essentially broken into 3 pieces. There's the opening, which is about 8 pages long, which is Reed fires the flare gun, and all the characters come running, and we're introduced to them one after another. And that seems like it was the last piece of that issue that was ever done. From there, we go into the actual origin of the Fantastic Four, which is done in about 6 pages. They're like 8-panel pages. They're jammed everywhere. Everything is very compressed and tight. And that was probably done first, and probably done as a longer piece that was cut apart and shaved down and reworked to make it only 6 pages. And then there's sort of the back half of the book, which is the Fantastic Four Battle of the Mole Man. And if you look at that and ignore all of the words, all the copy, Stan's dialoguing, and just look at the, whatever it is, 13 pages that's there, the way it's staged is it's staged like it's a self-contained adventure.
Yep.
Like all the characters, once again, are introduced, and their powers are treated like a revelation. There's a moment for half that story, the Thing is in an overcoat, so that there's an important moment where, at a dramatic point, where he has to fight a monster on Monster Island. He can pull off the coat and show you he's a monster too, and he's going to take the guy on. And the same thing with the torch, and the same thing with. It reads like the idea here is you as the reader are being introduced to this stuff for the first time. or maybe the second time.
Right.
And so trying to piece together how all these things were reworked to make Fantastic Four 1 is just like this interesting historical puzzle to me.
Yeah, we'll never know for sure, but all of the stuff that you talk about makes sense to me. And again, like you said, you look at it differently through the eyes of an editor than you did when you were 7.
Oh,
That
definitely.
and that you see, like you said, the places where there's a weird imbalance in the panel composition, and why is that character there? That throws everything off, and you start doing that. Like I said, I encourage everybody to go to tombrevoort.com and look up your crackpot theories about how all this works.
There's plenty of them,
Yeah.
and they change every time I go back and look at it. I
Yeah.
find something else. So if nothing else, I've gotten a lot of value out of my dime for Fantastic Four #1.
Yeah. Well, even only recently did I come around to this idea that Stan didn't even write issue 6, which I think is not the official line, but that's a good theory.
That was certainly a tough nut to swallow.
Yeah.
I'd seen the theory put out earlier by, I forget the name of the guy. I'd like to be able to credit him.
Yeah, me too. We're sorry.
Yeah, but he wrote a piece that ran in the Jack Kirby Collector about Fantastic Four #6, and he analyzed this. And I remember reading it at the time and thinking to myself, I don't know that I buy this. I've read Fantastic Four 6 a million times.
Right.
I don't feel like it sounds so much like Kirby's dialogue. It didn't stand out to me among the other issues. And then I went back. I had time, and I was writing these pieces, and I sat down and I went through it, and everything that he says is true and more. Like there's
Yes.
more evidence there even than he says. Enough so that I feel fairly confident in saying, yeah, I think Jack dialogued that job. Why he dialogued it, I don't know. Why just that one issue and none of the others? Because I immediately went and read 7,
Yeah.
thinking, okay, and 7 is back to being Stan. It's very clearly Stan's voice, and for some reason 6 is not.
Right.
And so again, I have some harebrained crackpot ideas as to why that might be, but again, we'll never know for certain.
And it's not radically different. It's just like you said, you get in there and you know it that well. You know Stan's voice that well. You get in there. I can't talk about it specifically, but I was doing some in-depth reading of the first 30 issues for a specific special project, and really diving in. And boy, yeah, you read issue 6 and it just stands out. It's neither worse nor better. It's just different. There's not as much snappy patter. There's a little more anger in it. There's
there's even the word choices, the cadence of the language, how things are verbalized. It's absolutely clear if you go into it and sort of study it, particularly having some some understanding of as to what Kirby's prose tended to sound like. And again, that's amazing to me because I must have read that comic 100 times over the years, and the thought never crossed my mind.
No.
And so that's all the stuff I like the best, when I can the penny can drop, or somebody can drop the penny on my head and I have to go back and take a second look at these things.
Yeah, there's nothing more fun, really, than learning something new about a story that you've read 40 years ago. You've been reading all your life. It's those little tidbits, really nice. And yeah, we'll never know why Stan just kind of let Jack have his head, but because he didn't do it very often. He did it with the Inhuman stuff that was much later.
Yeah. There's one Nick Fury story that Jack dialogued.
Yeah.
That Stan went back and like sort of heavily edited after the fact, so it's not so obviously Jack. There was the Inhuman stories that you talk about. There were a couple of mystery stories right at the end that again Jack dialogued, and Stan took a very heavy hand in editing, it seems like.
Yeah.
But and again, in that period, Stan was trying out other writers. He was trying to get more blood into Marvel as the company started to expand in these new superheroes. And so Jerry Siegel did stories as Joe Carter, and Robert Bernstein did stories, and a bunch of guys who'd been around the industry were writing stuff, and none of them ever quite worked out long term. So I sort of assumed that letting Kirby do this one issue was was the same kind of thing. Maybe Jack can do this, and then it's one more thing that I don't have to do.
Yeah.
And it seems like his answer at the end was, I don't think this is as smooth as I'd like it to be. I want to do it from now on.
Yeah. But you're right. He was casting a wide net early on with Jerry, with Robert, with
Don Rico. Don Rico.
Yeah. Human Torch creator. I'm blanking.
Carl Burgos.
Yeah, Burgos, who drew, not wrote, but did he write some of that stuff?
No, he drew. He drew a bunch of Giant Man and at least one Human Torch story.
That's right. Yeah. And the one that Stan apologizes for, I forget who drew that one, but there's one one of those Tales to Astonish issues where in the letter column to the next issue, doesn't it say, "We're really sorry. That last issue really was not up to snuff."
Effectively so. It was the Wrecker issue, and Stan,
I'm only barely paraphrasing. Yeah,
I know, and Stan tells a story that sounds like a cock and bull story about, well, we had another villain we were going to use, and it turned out he was too similar to somebody else, and so we had to rework the story at the last minute. And I think it just, like so many of these things, he would try out people, and the way he was doing comics was so counterintuitive in those days.
Yeah.
That if you had a Kirby or you had a Ditko, and then later had a Ramita or a Buscema, or guys that were skilled in that, or who wanted to either tell the story themselves, or wanted to have a lot of latitude, they would just go and they would fill in the blanks essentially.
Yeah.
Because Stan was giving in a lot of cases so little to people to do, and in the cases of a Kirby or Ditko, he may not have been giving much at all. They may have been coming in and giving to him. Stan, I got this idea for this guy. They're gonna fight this guy. Okay, Jack, that sounds great. Go do that, and I'll put the words in later. But so many of the artists that were coming in and were being tried out, all they'd done for their entire careers for 20 years was, hard and fast, full scripts. The panels is this, the dialogue is this. This is what you draw. Yeah. And so just being told, I need 13 pages. Iron Man fights a guy in a scarecrow costume. Maybe they steal some plans from Stark Industries. Oh, and Pepper Potts is mad at Tony.
Yeah.
And get some business in there with Happy Hogan. And they would go home and go, I don't know what the heck I'm supposed to draw here.
Who really couldn't handle it? And this is not he was a brilliant artist. It's not a slight on him, but Joe Orlando.
Joe Orlando, yes, I spoke to Joe about that specifically.
He did the first couple issues of Daredevil, or the first 2 or 3 issues of Daredevil, right? And not the first one, but the second one and maybe the third one. And boy, it's no fault of his, but those things are just they're heavy with captions, they're heavy with balloons. There's no continuity between panels. It's just he's desperately flailing around, and Stan's having to go back behind him with a shovel, just trying to fix things.
The story I heard from Joe, and realize this is the Joe Orlando version of it, so the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But I had to call Joe up. I put together the first Daredevil Masterworks.
Yeah.
And because those stories were being reprinted, I needed to reach out to Joe because we needed to send him like reprint money. And we didn't have an address or whatever, contact info on file, and he was still enough with DC at that point that I could get him on the phone. And what he told me was that for each of those issues of Daredevil, those were like 20-page stories, he drew 35 pages.
Holy smokes.
And that what would happen is he would draw, 5-6 pages, and he'd bring them into the office, and Stan would go over them. And about 3 pages in, he'd go, how about instead of this, Daredevil does this instead? He wouldn't be happy with whatever Joe had come up with. And so Joe would go back home, 3 of those pages tossed to the side, and he'd draw 5 more pages and come in. And Stan would go, here on this 4th page, what if instead of this happened? And so, this was the thing that apparently frustrated Orlando. And the reason he stopped doing more work for Marvel was that he was, he said, I was drawing the book like, almost twice and only getting paid for it once.
Yeah. Who else was like that? It's interesting. Early on, again, I mean, I think Don Heck had a hard time at first.
Yeah.
But I think he got it after.
Yes.
Yeah. And you can tell the places where Don is just completely off on his own. There's an early Avengers issue where Captain America's shield gets destroyed, like off panel, and then just shows back up later, and they actually they put a lantern on it. They say, "Oh my God, my shield's destroyed forever," and then nothing. So, just again, he was never my favorite growing up. Although he's one of those artists that I have come to appreciate as an adult. But the scratchy style, the sort of choppy storytelling, none of that stuff really worked for me growing up.
He was a better artist, like so many, before the size of the original art changed.
Yeah.
That in the as you know, and I will explain this for our viewers in the audience, round about 66, 67, the size of the original art was reduced by about a third. And the reason was that it was Murphy Anderson who had a production
we
company.
hold Murphy Anderson to blame for this. Yes, Murphy was the one who said, instead of photographing these pages one at a time, if you just make them, 2/3 the size, you can fit 4 on the bed and get a negative of all 4 at once. You save a lot of time, and everybody
a lot of money. A lot of money.
Yeah, and Marv, everybody in the business department cheered him, and everybody in the artistic department just wanted to throttle him because some guys never. Ditko recovered, kind of, but never fully. I don't think
a lot of guys didn't. Even Carmine, I think.
I don't think Carmine. Yeah, completely did.
Hurt.
Yeah,
it changed Kirby. Like post that. Like if you look at the months where the art size changes, both Kirby and even Stan are trying to figure out what they're doing. There's one Captain America story. It was in Tales of Suspense. I want to say 95, but I might be off by an issue. It's the first story that they do at the smaller size, and Stan hasn't accommodated for the fact that the lettering is going to be proportionately larger. And there's way. I mean those early 60s books were heavy in copy to begin with, but here there's no place to put anything.
Yeah.
And balloons are just like they're elbowed in everywhere. Yeah. And Kirby himself is not quite, like his rhythms or his sense of composition it's just a little off. He hasn't adjusted. He gets there pretty quickly and starts then being able to kind of see the page as a whole page, which was something he hadn't been doing before that, and that really changed and evolved how he drew pretty much from that point on going forward. But a lot of guys never quite recovered from that, and I think Don was one of them. All the stuff he did, you look at his 50s work. I find a lot of that work dull because I don't think the stories are very good, but I think they're beautifully drawn. I think he did some nice work on the Marvel Hero books when he had work that was sympathetic or stories that were sympathetic to him and better inkers. Often he was being inked by whoever happened to be around. So some better jobs, some worse jobs. He was very much in that. Another outgrowth of that Milton Caniff style that was everywhere in those days.
Yeah.
And not really a superhero artist per se. So he was a guy that kind of had to learn to do superheroes, and particularly, Marvel Jack Kirby style superheroes, as on the job training as he was doing it.
Yeah. I know that DC, there's a demarcation where you can tell the month the page, when's the page sizes change, because they used to run a masthead on the top of every issue with the 2 DC bullets and then the title of the book. And when that's gone, that's the month that they change the dimensions of the pages. So that's easy to find in the DC books. I don't remember. Is there any sort of tip for the Marvel stuff? You just kind of have to eyeball it and know.
You kind of have to eyeball it and know, particularly since every series shifted slightly differently. Like there are issues of Tales of Suspense or Tales to Astonish where one of the stories was drawn twice up and the other story was drawn 1.5.
Yeah.
Just based on how far ahead, different artists were on their assignments and things. So it's not like there's a month and you can go, it's this month, it's July 1967 or whatever. It really is. You could stare at it, and if you're looking for it, you can spot it a mile away. The one place where it's super obvious is in the It's Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 5, the origin of Peter Parker's parents annual, because the page size changes halfway through.
Yep.
Larry Lieber had drawn like half the annual, which he was doing over the course of a year because it was an annual. And the second half, he had to switch to the smaller boards. And so you hit this page, and I believe it's a splash page. It's the splash page where they reveal the Red Skull, and suddenly the lettering is bigger.
Yeah.
And suddenly the compositions all shift. And so it's very obvious there. The lettering size is usually
there's your big clue.
Yeah.
What else do we know about comics of that age? So for the 6 people who are still watching, who are all older than us. What else do we know about comics of that age?
Boy, you put me on the spot now.
I know. Well, all right. Well, let me leap over because I think we promised people we talk a little bit about Fantastic Four.
Yes.
So I've been, again, people who follow TomBrevoort.com who follow your month by month diary listings, basically retroactive diary listings of every comic you read and when you came in. But I'm trying to remember which one you picked up, what your first Fantastic Four exposure was.
My first Fantastic Four, again, it's a slightly complicated story in that I started not being a Marvel fan.
Right. So like me, we have that in common as well.
Yeah, and some of it is the era, and it's the same kind of thing. Like I started reading comics much like you did when I was 6.
Right.
And at 6 and at 7, I often didn't have much control over what comics I got. My dad would bring a comic home, or we'd go to a store and they'd give me a comic.
Right.
And so I would get haphazardly issues of Marvel books, and in almost every case I didn't like them. Partly because they were all continued stories, partly because they were being written at a slightly different level than the DC books of the period, which were very self-contained, and often so self-contained that you could have a 14-page Flash story and then like 7 pages of Green Lantern. That's also like a story, or the Atom, or Green Arrow, and that you might get a 2-parter. If it was a 3-parter, it was like a huge deal. Holy smoke!
Yeah,
he's going to fight him for 3 issues.
Right.
That's unheard of. So all the early Marvel books that I sampled, I didn't like at all. And so my dad used to give me grief years later because I spent years. I had to drum this into people. Marvel comics stink. Don't bring me Marvel comics.
Yeah.
And so when I started reading Marvel comics and started doing stuff, my dad was like, "But I thought Marvel comics stink," and I said, "Shut up."
It was a great line last night. I was listening to the Beastie Boys documentary that they've done, and they're talking about their history. And there was a great line where somebody called them on they were talking very, very positively about gender issues and so forth. And somebody called them out and said, "Come on, you're the Beastie Boys." And one of them said, "I'd rather be a hypocrite than somebody who never changes."
Yeah.
Which I love that.
Yeah. For sure. Good on them.
Yeah. So exactly. So what was the first FF then?
So again, to make this slightly more complicated, there were very few books on the history of comics in those days, or the early to mid 70s.
Right.
And so I had a copy of Jules Pfeiffer's Greatest Comic Book Heroes, and I had a copy of Stranko's History of Comics that you mentioned earlier. But in both cases, like the Pfeiffer book reprints old Golden Age stories and has a framing sequence that is the article he wrote for Playboy, sort of talking about the glory days of the Golden Age. And there was a Human Torch story, and a Cap story, and a Submariner story in it, and I didn't read any of them.
Yeah.
I owned the book. I had it for months. I didn't read any of them because Marvel comics are bad and I don't like them.
I get
and why
that.
would I read this? And the same thing with the Stranko book. Like, I read that thing front to back, except I skipped the 2 chapters on Captain America and the Marvel heroes, the timely heroes, because those are bad. And why would I read those?
Yeah.
And so that summer there was one day, and in those days, like, a summer day was not like it is today. There is no internet. There's only whatever is on television that's on television on the 5 channels that you have on your black and white television set. If there's nobody around, if there's nothing going on, your options are super limited. And so that was the day that I cracked, and I went, okay, I will read now these. I'm rereading, or I'm looking through the Pfeiffer book. I'll read the Marvel stories, and I read them, and I liked them just fine.
Yeah.
And I read then through the Steranko chapters and went, oh, okay. So of the 3, the Human Torch story was the most a story. Like the others, the Cap story is just his origin.
Right.
So he becomes Captain America and not much else happens. And the Submariner story is just 12 pages of him knocking buildings down in Manhattan.
Right.
But the Human Torch story, he goes out, he fights a villain, he does tricky things with fire, it's kind of cool. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll let me check out what's going on with the Human Torch these days. And I'd known from osmosis, because you absorbed all this stuff from, the trading cards and the stickers and the lunch boxes and the whatnot, that the Human Torch was now in Fantastic Four. In my area, we had a drugstore chain. I've stopped using the name of the drugstore chain as I talk about this, because while I don't think they're still there, I don't want to get sued.
Okay.
And that's because what I figured out years later is they had a big, what I call a big bin of comics, big like wire bin.
Right.
In my memory, it's enormous, but in reality, it was probably regular size.
Yeah.
And it was full of comics. It was always there. It was entirely Marvel, nothing but Marvel, all 9 months to 2 years old.
So this is all affidavit stuff.
These were absolutely illegal affidavit return books that were being sold off the back of the truck when they should have been destroyed. And so this drugstore would sell them, like 6 for $1.
Yeah.
And I would go through, and before I was even a Marvel reader, I would comb through them, because every once in a while, by a fluke, there'd be an issue of Detective Comics.
Right. All right.
And I would get out with my one issue of Detective or Action. So I went to the drugstore the next time my family went, and I dug through the bin and I picked up 3 issues. They had 3 consecutive issues that at the time were, again, about 9-10 months old, which was Fantastic Four 177, 178, 179.
So George, Marvin,
Yes,
Marvin George
yes.
at that point. Yeah.
Roy and George, and
George,
and a little Ron Wilson in the last one.
Right, because it was Roy and then Len and then Marv, right?
Yes.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah. It was Roy, and it was everybody, and then it was Len.
Yeah.
Because it looked like Roy left in a hurry, and there were issues there where Jim Shooter kind of plotted it with Roger Stern, and Bill Mantlo kind of scripted it, but Len did some touch-ups, and so that part was a mess. But I read the 3 issues, stretched out under the coffee table in my living room, and I've liked them. And so the next time we went back to the drugstore, I dug around in that bin again, and I pulled out 3 issues of Marvel's Greatest Comics, which was 58, 59, 60, which reprinted FF 76, 77, 78. And I read those, and I liked those even more. Those were Stan and Jack comics. And from that point, I started buying Fantastic Four.
Yeah. I came in earlier, and it was
141, right?
Yeah, 141, 140, because it was. And I think that was the last of the mainstream Marvel books that I finally caught on to. I started with, like you, I started with a few Marvels when I was much younger. But again, I was a DC fan. I didn't know what are you going to do with it. There's an X-Men comic and it's continued. I can buy an issue of Jimmy Olsen and get 3 stories for that.
Right, right.
Complete, because at 6, all comics are good. No. Jimmy Olsen's just as good as the X-Men when you're that age. So,
in fairness, when X-Men was a reprint title, or X-Men was reprinting, technically it was at least a 50-50 chance that your Jimmy Olsen had a better story.
That's very true. So Spider-Man 100 I picked up, and that started that, and then that quickly. That's the beauty of what Stan had, the machine that Stan had set up that doesn't work as well today, because comics are too expensive to just grab a fistful on a whim, is that for 20 cents, I could, oh wait, this is an Avengers story, but it has the X-Men in it. I should check out these X-Men. And I would check it for 20 cents. It's nothing, and you go pop that money, and then you build and you build and you build. The FF was the last I don't know why I stayed away as long as I did, but I do know that I had picked up that issue kind of at random. I was on vacation with my father and stepmother, and it was difficult. There was a lot of tension. The divorce was very fresh. Very, very fresh. And so I dove into that issue of Fantastic Four looking for some measure of escapism. As I was in the middle of, I remember I was in the middle of nowhere. I remember we were in that was literally the only comic book that was available at the newsstand. And I picked it up, and at the end of it, it's, hey, Reed, you're being served for divorce. Oh, jeez, man. Yeah. So it's only my anal retentive, I have to have every issue that I think that, kept me coming back next issue. It still took me a while to fall in love, and I really don't think I fell in love with the FF until you called me and asked me to do it.
Until you were writing them, yes.
Yeah.
I remember us having this conversation.
Yeah.
Because I called you up and it took a little work. Like you had to go away. I pitched you on it. I said we had, Mike Waringo was going to draw it, and I gave you my 10-cent dissertation on the FF and why I thought you could write it and what you could do with it. I don't remember any of it other than I remember we talked about, Reed is like Doc Savage.
That was it. Yeah. Yeah. That was my memory of that was that was really what my takeaway was from our conversation, is that so much has been done with Ben, and so much has been done with Johnny, and so much has been done with Sue, and nobody likes Reed.
Right.
And no, people don't hate Reed. It's just back that we're talking about in that period of the 90s, early 2000s. Nobody, 80s, 90s, Reed was kind of a meh character.
Yeah.
You didn't hate him, but you didn't like him. Thing was the big star. And I thought, okay, maybe I can be the guy to make you like Reed. Because I like the genius characters. I like the smarty, the smart leader, quiet characters.
Yep.
And yeah, talking about him being Doc Savage, talking about him being almost Buckaroo Banzai in a way.
Yes.
Without the weird quirkiness, but still the weird affectations that Reed would have, and the sort of off-putting of his think that his personality had sort of off-putting nature to it sometimes, because he's always somewhere else. So
yeah, I think, and I didn't know about your like your X-Men character is Cyclops. You connected with Cyclops. I feel the same way. And if I had known that, I absolutely would have used that in my pitch. Because Reed is also the Cyclops character in FF. It's just he's also the Professor X character. He's both.
Yeah, you're right.
That thing. But what you ended up doing there clearly worked, because I think starting with your run and Mike's run, pretty much everybody that came after it, Reed was the lead character, and everybody else, like now you can't find a run where Johnny's the main one or Sue's the main one.
Right.
It was all Mark Miller, Reed, JMS, Reed, John Hickman, Reed, like down the line, Matt Fraction, Reed, so that had made a very strong impact on the audience, it seems like.
Well, you don't get enough credit for it, and I've talked about this, but people give me all the credit for his speech at the end of our first issue, where he talks about how this is all really a way of making up for ruining his friends' lives. And the words are mine, but the idea of that mostly came from you in our conversations, and I'm very grateful for that. I always have been.
Well, I appreciate that. Again, I've forgotten all of that.
Oh, then it's all me. Then I forget everything I just said.
It should as it should be. That's the compact.
Job. Right. That's the editor's job. Right.
That's the way it works. Yes.
Yep.
So I believe that, and I try to you do it and live by it. And it wouldn't, regardless of how good or bad whatever nonsense that I said was, it would not have worked if you and Mike didn't make it work on the actual page. Yeah. So I've tossed off a lot of ideas. You and I, when we were trying to figure out that first issue of FF, there was a story, there was a version of it that I pitched to you. It was about like a Latvian holiday, and Reed is summoned to the Latvian embassy.
Yeah.
And it's Doom and Reed, and they're having this dinner. But what's really going on is that it's an elaborate, like, sort of mental chess game that, during this day, Reed, Doom is not permitted to kill Reed because of reasons. But he set a bunch of things into motion, and Reed, guessing that he would do that, has Sue and Ben and Johnny in different places to counter those things, and it becomes this whole dynamic. And we didn't do any of it. We didn't use it at all. And like 5 or 6 years later, I called Dwayne McDuffie up because we needed an FF special, and I pitched it. I threw the same. I think I even pulled the email out and said, "Yeah, I had this idea years ago with Mark, and I sent it to him." And then he made a completely different story out of it. It's, the version that he did is not at all what I pitched him. It has sort of a common seed. So, there is a holiday. Reed does come to see Doom. They do have this conversation. They literally play chess while stuff is going on. But, he makes it entirely his own. So, is that my story? No, not really. It's just an idea. ideas are, as you know, are a dime a dozen.
Yep.
And
It's all
so,
execution. Yeah.
yeah, it's all execution.
But that said, I mean, you are a generous collaborator. You are, and I've said this before. You're the best editor in comics, as far as I'm concerned, because you're not.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice.
You're not pushy. You know what you want, and you know what works and doesn't work. But the thing that more editors could take a cue from is the notion that you're not dictatorial, in the sense that if there's an issue with something, if there's something that isn't working for you, you'll let me know. You'll flag it. You'll suggest something, but not something that you're wedded to. And then it's something that you and I can talk about. And there's some flexibility there, as opposed to, there was another editor I work with, who I will not name, who was not a bad editor, but his bomb sites were off. Like, just like 2 pages, because he would always read a script and he would always have a problem with page 14. Doesn't work. I don't know why it doesn't work, but it doesn't work. And he'd look at it and go, no, the problem isn't page 14. The problem is page 11.
Right.
Now I understand. And then I have to go back but it was a very frustrating experience, because there was no dialogue there. It was just, I'm the editor. I don't like this. Go fix it. And that's no way to be.
Yeah. I know who you're talking about too. I think we've had this conversation.
I think
before.
we have. Yeah. I think I've used the bomb site analogy a few times.
But that's that's a good that's a good example. Like, I try and I teach the younger editors at Marvel the same kind of thing. Like, if I'm given feedback on a script or story, I want to point to things that I see as problems. And I often, as much as possible, I want to offer a potential solution, but I don't care if you use my solution or not. What I care about is that the problem is solved. And I always add this little rider, which is, and convincing me that what I think is a problem isn't actually a problem is a valid solution.
Yeah.
You can convince me that, I don't think this works, but trust me, it does. And here's why. And I think you should let me do it. I could be convinced in those instances, hopefully, sometimes, if people are, if the problem is genuinely not that, to go, okay, or I'll roll the dice and we'll see how this comes out. Very few people die in the production of comics, so
yeah.
If you guess wrong, it's okay. No animals are harmed. The children sleep soundly.
Well, there's another thing that you and I have in common about editorial, which is that we both, at the end of the day, while obviously you want to be editing the script when it comes in, you really don't get into the editorial mode until you got the whole page in front of you. Like, you like editing on the page.
Yes, I think again, it's not like I don't look at art as it comes in. It's not like I don't read scripts and dialogue pads. But for me, and I liken it to when we were working on Fantastic Four, my primary assistant was Mark Sumerak, and we didn't think of ourselves as editors so much. Like, the term we used is we're like mechanics. We're like the pit crew.
Yeah.
You bring the car in, and we're racing out, and we're tightening lug nuts, and we're swapping wheels and things out in the engine, and then get it on the road and go. So I don't think you can really understand how a comic is working unless you've got both the art and the lettering, even if it's formative lettering, there together. And the fact that now everything is done digitally, whereas when I started, books were lettered on the page. Like, you really had to be on your marks, at a stage where you always couldn't necessarily always understand exactly how things were going to translate, because once you put that dialogue down, moving it or changing it was going to be a huge undertaking.
Right.
And now it's, as the letters who work for me sadly decry, it is far too easy.
Yeah.
To change or to move or to shift or put that balloon in the other panel. That rhythm works better now. But I honestly don't think you can completely fine tune that stuff unless you've got all the pieces there in front of you.
No, like you, when I'm reading a script, I'm really sort of reading it for big problems, and I'm reading it for general structure, but I'm really not reading it like I would the finished comic. There's just, first off, comic scripts are just not any fun to read. I think that's something that all comic book editors know. They're just no fun to read. But yeah, same thing. I know it's not fair to the poor letterers who have to go back and rework, but it's just, you got to edit on the page at the end of the day, or else it's all the pieces aren't there.
Yeah, it's the term I use when I'm reading a script, particularly a script that's just come in from a writer, hasn't gone to an artist yet, is it drawable?
Yeah.
You know, which is to say, does the plot more or less make sense? Is every scene accomplish something? Does it move the ball up the field narratively? Is there a point to it? Are there any obvious plot holes? Is everything covered? Do I care if every line of dialogue is perfect? No.
Not at this point. No, not the stage. No. Yeah.
There's plenty, and I could fuss over that now, but once the page is drawn, I may learn that I don't need that line of dialogue at all, or I may find that I need 6.
Right.
And so it just means I'm going to work twice or 3 times on the same thing if I, get anal about it and try to make everything perfect before the thing is drawn.
Yeah.
Is it drawable? Can it be drawn? If it can, let somebody draw it, and then put it together with the lettering.
Yeah, we'll take next steps. Well, I'm keeping one eye on the clock just for as a
we're down to the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, but I mean, this has been a lot of fun. We both came into this with absolutely no prep and no idea what we were going to be talking about, but I think it seems to have worked out pretty well.
We have filled 60 minutes, as was the mandate. So, yay, team!
And I will point out to our moderator that because I have a problem with StreamYard, as we all saw last night during the Ringo Awards, he said, wanting to cut his own throat.
What happened?
With StreamYard, if somebody else comes into the studio, I can't hear or see them until I reboot and re-enter the studio. So in a moment, like for instance, I came in after you on this one. I can't hear or see myself on my own screen. I just see you. And so when the next person comes in, I know. So it'll all be blank. The next person, and then I have to sign back on, sign in, sign back out. And this is the world we're living in now, and we will solve this eventually. But I just wanted to throw that out to Chuck, whoever is listening in, and just be aware that when you come back in, I ain't going to be able to hear you. So I'll just bow out when you come in. And there you go. He's probably there. He is right there.
I'll come back in. How's everybody doing?
Let's make sure. No, Chuck, you're just a name and a blank screen. So I think I will bow out, and I will be talking to Susan Eisenberg and George Newbern in a couple of hours, in an hour, I guess, at the 7 o'clock California, 10 o'clock Eastern time panel, where the actors from the DCU cartoons are going to be acting out scenes from Kingdom Come.
That's going to be amazing. We get the actual voices of Superman
Thanks
and
so much,
Wonder
Tom.
Woman.
I really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure.
All right, tapping out.
Bye. All right, guys, we're going to take about a 1-minute break. Tom, thank you. And Mark, obviously, who can't hear me, thank you guys so much. This was one of the most informative and fun panels we've done all weekend.
Well, again, happy to be a part of it. Hope everybody enjoys the rest of the convention, and we'll hopefully see everybody next year.
Oh, yeah. Well, Tom, thank you so much. We're going to take about a 1-minute break, about a 60-second break as we queue up the next panel, and we are going to do a deep dive into the dark, scary rooftops of Gotham City. And we're going to talk to all the creators of all the amazing DC Batman books that are out there right now. So, guys, stick around. We'll be back in just 1 sec.